Zechariah, a name that, when translated, echoes a promise. The Lord remembers. And have you ever stopped to think about the weight of those words? In a world where everything seems so fleeting, where people easily forget their promises and commitments, there's something incredibly powerful in knowing that God never forgets. Zechariah was someone who carried that meaning deep in his essence, but his story goes way beyond his name. He grew up in a unique situation. After the untimely death of his father, Zechariah, he was raised by his grandfather, Iddo. Just imagine that for a second, losing your father so young and yet blossoming into a prophetic voice of hope for your people. Isn't it interesting how, so often, it's the toughest situations that bring out our true strength? This family dynamic must have shaped Zechariah in a unique way. A boy growing up under the watchful eyes of his grandfather, probably listening to ancient stories, soaking in precious lessons about God's faithfulness. That's something many of us can relate to in our own lives. How many of us are shaped by the voices and experiences of the generations before us? It's just like the Bible teaches. Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. That was Zechariah's reality, but it could be yours too. Think about the lessons you've learned, the legacy you carry. On top of that, Zechariah lived during a time that was anything but peaceful. He was around during a period of great instability when Jerusalem was trying to rebuild itself after the Babylonian exile. Now picture this, a young man tasked with being God's voice at a time when people were tired, discouraged, and struggling to rebuild. Not just walls and temples, but their hopes too. Zechariah wasn't just a prophet, he was an emotional and spiritual leader. God chose him because he knew Zechariah could inspire people to look beyond the immediate chaos and see the bigger picture. One striking point is that Zechariah's mission started early. He was about 20 years old when he began to prophesy. Think about that for a moment. A young man with the weight of delivering divine messages to an entire nation. And here's a practical takeaway for us. How often do we underestimate the impact young people can have? How many times have you thought you were too young or too inexperienced for something? Zechariah proves the opposite. God doesn't choose based on age or human experience. He chooses based on the heart. Zechariah's message is also a reminder that God works across generations. While his grandfather, Iddo, was part of the spiritual leaders of his time, Zechariah brought a fresh perspective. It's like God saying, I use the older generation to teach wisdom and the younger generation to bring vision. That's something we can all apply to our lives. Have you ever thought about how you can be both a mentor and someone who's still learning and growing? After all, life is a continuous cycle of teaching and being taught. Another fascinating aspect is that Zechariah's life reflects the promise that God never abandons his people. Despite the struggles, he was used as a vessel to remind Jerusalem that God hadn't forgotten them. Here's a practical thought. How many times have you felt like you were alone in your struggles? Maybe you need to hear this today. God hasn't forgotten you. He remembers every promise, every tear, every silent prayer you've made. And of course, we can't overlook how Zechariah's personal story became a collective mission. The pain of losing his father, the responsibility of being raised by his grandfather, and his divine calling all came together to create a journey that impacted an entire nation. His life is a reminder that God can transform even the most painful losses into greater purposes. Just like he did with Zechariah, he can do the same with you. As we dive deeper into Zechariah's story, his mission begins to unfold even more meaningfully. After all, he wasn't just called to remind people of who God is. He was called to lead them during a time of literal and spiritual rebuilding. This brings us to the next point, Zechariah's role in the reconstruction of the temple, something that transcends bricks and mortar, reaching into the deeper issues of faith and perseverance. Zechariah played a crucial role during one of the toughest moments in Jerusalem's history, the rebuilding of the temple. Picture the scene, a weary people, fresh out of Babylonian captivity, returning to a land that seemed like a shadow of its former glory. The temple, the heart of their worship to God, was in ruins. To many, the idea of rebuilding it felt impossible. But that's where Zechariah and the prophet Haggai came in, two voices carrying God's divine determination amidst human chaos. Can you imagine the courage it took to inspire a broken people to rise against all odds? The temple wasn't just a building, it symbolized God's presence among his people. Zechariah understood that, and through his messages, he emphasized the importance of prioritizing its reconstruction. But here's the kicker. He didn't just encourage with words, he spoke with divine authority. It was as if he was saying, "This isn't just a physical project, it's an act of faith." And that same principle applies today. Think about something in your life that needs rebuilding. Maybe it's your faith, your trust in God, or even a relationship. Zechariah's message is still relevant because it reminds us that every step we take in our restoration process is a declaration that we still believe in God's plan. Now, consider the challenges the people faced. It wasn't just about the physical labor of rebuilding walls. They were battling discouragement, opposition from external enemies, and internal conflicts. Anyone who's tried to make a big change in their life knows exactly what that feels like, right? It's like starting a diet or trying to build a new habit. There's no shortage of voices telling you it's not going to work. But Zechariah and Haggai were like spiritual coaches, constantly motivating the people not to give up. In one of his prophecies, Zechariah reminded them that the strength to complete the work would come not by might nor by power, but by God's Spirit. Zechariah 4:6. That's a reminder for us too. When our strength runs out, we can always lean on God's. Another practical takeaway from this historical moment is the power of community. The rebuilding of the temple wasn't a one-man job. It was a collective effort that required everyone's collaboration. And the same goes for us. So often we think we can tackle our challenges alone, but Zechariah shows us there's strength in working together and sharing the load. So ask yourself, who are the people standing beside you in the rebuilding of your life? And more importantly, how can you be a support to others in their journeys? Interestingly, the temple's reconstruction took about 4 years to complete, from 520 to 516 BC. 4 years! In today's world, where we expect instant results, that might feel like an eternity. But it's a powerful reminder that the best things in life take time. Think about it. You might be in the middle of the process, laying invisible bricks, but every small step is essential. God works behind the scenes, even when it feels like nothing's happening. Zechariah also brought visions of encouragement to the people, reminding them that the temple wasn't just a building, it was the beginning of something much bigger. He prophesied that this temple would one day be the stage for something extraordinary, the coming of the Messiah. Imagine hearing that while holding a shovel or hammer, trying to rebuild fallen walls. It's like he was saying, "You're not just building for now, you're building for the future." That's something we can apply to our own lives. Every step of faith, every act of obedience is paving the way for something greater that we can't see yet. Another fascinating detail is how Zechariah and Haggai balanced their messages. While Haggai was more straightforward and focused on immediate results, Zechariah was all about reminding the people of the bigger picture. He'd say, this isn't just about a temple, it's about God's kingdom. Maybe that's a perspective you need today. You might be so caught up in daily struggles that you've lost sight of the bigger purpose. Zechariah teaches us to align our everyday actions with God's vision. Speaking of a bigger purpose, the rebuilt temple became a symbol of renewal and hope for future generations. It's a testament that God always keeps his promises, even when things seem hopeless. Zechariah was living proof that God not only remembered his people, but had greater plans for them. And that's the truth you need to hold on to. God remembers you, and he's building something in your life, even if you can't see the final result yet. This rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was spiritual too. As the people raised walls and placed stones, something deeper was happening. They were reclaiming their identity as God's chosen nation. And that brings us to the next chapter in Zechariah's story, where his messages take on even deeper meaning, filled with visions pointing not just to the present, but to the glorious future God had in store for his people. Zechariah's prophetic messages are a real treasure trove of divine revelation. Split into two main sections, they didn't just speak to the people of his time, they hold truths that have echoed through the centuries right to us today. Chapters 1 to 8 focus on encouragement and visions during the temple's reconstruction, while chapters 9 to 14 shine a light on future events, including jaw-dropping prophecies about the Messiah. And here's the kicker: every word, every vision pointed to something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It was like God was revealing pieces of a divine puzzle. In the earlier chapters, Zechariah shares messages that feel like reminders of God's deep love for his people. He starts by calling the Israelites back to God, saying, "Return to me, and I will return to you." Zechariah 1:3. Isn't that powerful? It's a direct invitation, but it's also full of grace. Maybe that's something you need to hear today. Sometimes we're so caught up in trying to handle our struggles on our own that we forget the solution lies in God. Returning to him isn't just an act of faith. It's a step toward peace and restoration. Then in chapters 9 to 14, Zechariah steps into territory that goes way beyond his time. He starts prophesying about the Messiah in astonishing detail. One of his most famous prophecies describes Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem on a donkey. Just think about that for a second. About 500 years before it happened, Zechariah was painting this picture with precision. That says something profound about God. He doesn't just know the future, he's in complete control of it. And if he could orchestrate something that monumental, imagine what he can do in your life. Another fascinating thing is how the focus shifts from the physical rebuilding of the temple in the early chapters to a much bigger vision of a spiritual temple in the later ones. Zechariah wasn't just talking about a building. He was pointing to the kingdom of God, the arrival of Jesus, and the ultimate restoration. It's like he was telling the people, what you're experiencing now is just the beginning. The best is yet to come. And that message still resonates with us today. You might be going through a tough time, but remember, God always has a bigger plan. Zechariah's messages also teach us the importance of seeing beyond what's right in front of us. In his time, the people were so focused on their immediate struggles, like opposition and scarcity, that it was easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. But Zechariah challenged them to look to the future with hope. Similarly, we can learn to trust that God is working for our good, even when we can't see it. It's just like the Bible reminds us, for we live by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7. One key aspect of his prophecies is the balance between judgment and redemption. Zechariah didn't shy away from addressing the people's failings, but he always pointed to God's grace as the solution. He shows us that while our choices have consequences, God always offers a way back. It's like a loving parent who disciplines but does so with care. That challenges us to reflect. How are we responding to God's correction in our lives? Are we willing to change and return to him? Zechariah also spoke of both the physical and spiritual restoration of Israel, something that still resonates today. He foresaw a time when God's people would be gathered and restored, not just as a nation, but as a testament to his faithfulness. For us, It's a reminder that God doesn't just restore what's lost, He does it abundantly. Think about the areas in your life that need restoration. Zechariah encourages us to surrender them to God, trusting that He can turn even the hardest moments into something glorious. His messages also include warnings, like the need for genuine obedience and repentance. Zechariah called out religious hypocrisy and urged the people to seek God with sincere hearts. That's so relevant today, isn't it? How often does spirituality become superficial or just part of a routine? Zechariah challenges us to go deeper, to pursue a real connection with God. Maybe it's time to ask yourself, are you living out your faith authentically, or are you just going through the motions? Finally, Zechariah shows us that God's messages are never just for the present. They always have eternal implications. While he encouraged the people during the temple's reconstruction, he was also paving the way for the Messiah. That's one of the biggest lessons we can take away. Our actions today have a ripple effect that goes beyond us. Be like Zechariah, someone who lived to point others toward God. And as we dive deeper into Zechariah's visions, we start to see that his messages weren't just poetic words. They were loaded with symbols and profound meanings, pointing to a future where God would bring both judgment and restoration. These visions take us to a whole new level of understanding about God's plan, something we'll explore even further in the next chapter. Zechariah wasn't just a prophet with words of encouragement, he was a visionary, literally. God blessed him with 8 visions that weren't just extraordinary, but also deeply symbolic, like each detail was a piece of a divine puzzle. These visions, recorded in chapters 1 through 6, came to him in a single night. Can you imagine that? It was like God unleashed a flood of revelations, each carrying a vital message for the people of Israel, and by extension, for all of us. The first vision Zechariah received was of horses patrolling the earth, a clear symbol of God's sovereign control over all nations. Have you ever stopped to think about that? In a world that often feels chaotic and out of control, it's comforting to know that nothing escapes God's watchful eye. He sees it all, understands it all, and, most importantly, has a plan to restore what's broken. Just like in the vision, where God promised comfort and restoration for Jerusalem, we too can trust that He's working behind the scenes of our own stories. In another vision, Zechariah saw 4 horns and 4 craftsmen representing the powers that oppressed Israel and the divine forces that would defeat them. That's such a powerful reminder that no enemy is too big for God. Think about something in your life that feels like an unmovable obstacle. Maybe it's financial struggles, a broken relationship, or even an internal battle. Just as God raised up craftsmen to deal with the horns, He has His ways of resolving the challenges we face. Sometimes the solution comes in ways we least expect, but it's always perfectly aligned with His plan. The third vision is one of the most inspiring moments. Zechariah saw a man measuring Jerusalem, and God declared that the city wouldn't need walls because He Himself would be its protection. Isn't that amazing? The idea of God being a wall of fire around us is both comforting and empowering. In our lives, we can often feel exposed, vulnerable, like we're defenseless. But Zechariah reminds us that God is our shield, our ultimate protection against anything that comes our way. No wonder the Bible constantly urges us to put our trust in Him, because those who trust in the Lord are truly secure. One of the most intriguing visions is that of the high priest Joshua, dressed in filthy clothes, being accused by Satan, only to be cleansed and clothed in pure garments. This image is a clear depiction of God's grace. We all have our flaws, our dirty clothes, but God, in His infinite mercy, cleanses us and makes us new. This is especially meaningful for anyone carrying the weight of guilt or regret. Zechariah, shows us that God isn't here to condemn us. He's here to restore us. He clothes us in his righteousness, no matter what our past looks like. The vision of the golden lampstand and 2 olive trees is equally significant. It represents the Holy Spirit and the power he provides to accomplish God's work. It's in this vision that we find the famous words, "Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit," Zechariah 4:6. How often do we try to handle everything on our own, only to realize our strength isn't enough? Zechariah reminds us that it's the Holy Spirit who empowers us. So why not start leaning on him more? Maybe it's time to hand over to God the burdens you've been trying to carry on your own. Another vision that stands out is the woman in a basket, symbolizing wickedness being removed. It's a strong image, but it's also filled with hope. Zechariah shows us that God doesn't just forgive sin, he removes it, completely cleansing what's wrong. Think about it practically. How often do we try to sweep our problems under the rug instead of dealing with them head-on? God invites us to let him not just forgive, but completely transform the things that hold us back. And who could forget the vision of the 4 chariots emerging from between 2 bronze mountains? They represent God's angels, sent out to carry out his will across the earth. It's like a reminder that God has his messengers working in every corner of the world. Even when it feels like he's distant, he's actively involved in every detail. Maybe that's exactly what you need to hear today. God is never absent. He always has a plan, and his angels are constantly at work. These visions, though complex and filled with symbolism, form a mosaic that paints a picture of judgment and restoration, warning and hope. Zechariah didn't just encourage the people to rebuild the temple. He urged them to renew their faith. That makes us reflect. How can we apply these messages to our own lives? What walls do we need to start rebuilding? What areas in our lives need God's cleansing and restoration? And since these visions point both to the present and the future, they prepare us to grasp the even bigger plans God revealed to Zechariah about judgment and restoration, truths that remain essential for us today. Zechariah wasn't just a prophet who spoke about restoration. He also tackled the tough subject of judgment. It's like he reflected God's heart, revealing both his justice and his mercy. Throughout his prophecies, it's clear that while God won't tolerate injustice, he also refuses to give up on offering his people another chance. This balance between judgment and restoration is like 2 sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. One of Zechariah's most impactful messages is about the judgment of false shepherds. He condemned leaders who led people astray, exploited the vulnerable, and neglected their spiritual responsibilities. Think about it. How often do we see leaders, whether in religious, family, or professional contexts, fail to guide with integrity? Zechariah reminds us that God sees it all. He not only judges leaders who abuse their authority, but also raises up others, filled with purpose, to take their place. That's both a warning and an encouragement to be better leaders in every area of our lives. Zechariah also spoke about battles surrounding Jerusalem, a theme that carries both judgment and redemption. He predicted intense conflicts, but made it clear that God would never abandon his chosen city. Imagine how comforting that must have been for a people living under constant adversity. It was a reminder that even when chaos seems to take over, God is still in control. And this principle is just as true today. When it feels like our lives are surrounded by battles, we can rest in the fact that God always has the final word. Another fascinating point is Zechariah's vision of Jerusalem's restoration under Christ's reign. He described a glorious city where God would be at the center of everything. This wasn't just a message for the people back then, it's a prophecy that still resonates today. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how broken things may seem, God has the power to restore everything to its original glory, or even better. Think about how that applies to your own life. What areas need divine restoration? Zechariah challenges us to trust that God can turn even the darkest ruins into something beautiful. However, the restoration Zechariah prophesied didn't come without judgment first. This teaches us that God is just and that his actions are always perfectly balanced. He doesn't ignore sin or wrongdoing, but he also doesn't leave us in our broken state. It's like a loving parent disciplining a child, not out of anger, but to teach and guide them, while still offering a comforting embrace. That dynamic of judgment and grace is something we can apply in our daily lives, especially in our relationships. How can we balance truth and love? Zechariah gives us a clear example to follow. Zechariah also painted a picture of a future where Jerusalem would be a place of safety and peace, a restored city under Christ's reign. This vision goes beyond physical restoration. It points to a complete spiritual transformation. God doesn't just fix what's broken, he makes all things new, and that's a promise we can hold on to. No matter where you are today, God's restoration isn't just possible, it's guaranteed for those who trust in him. The prophecies of Zechariah also highlight that God's judgment is an act of love, not vengeance. His desire is for his people to return to him, and judgment is his way of correcting the course. That makes us stop and think, how do we respond when God corrects us? Are we quick to resist or reject it, or do we allow his discipline to shape us into something better? That's a question Zechariah invites us to consider. One of the most moving moments in his prophecies is the image of God as a warrior fighting for his people. Zechariah describes God coming down with power to protect his people and defeat their enemies. This image isn't just grand, it's deeply personal. God isn't some distant observer. He's actively fighting for you. Maybe that's exactly what you need to hear today. No matter how big the battle you're facing, Zechariah reminds us that God is by your side, fighting on your behalf. And of course, the ultimate message of restoration is one of the most important. Zechariah speaks of a future where Christ will reign over all nations, uniting people and establishing his kingdom of peace. This is the climax of his prophecies, a reminder that God's plan is always redemptive. That glorious future is a promise that gives us hope even in the darkest moments. And as we reflect on that coming reign, we're challenged to apply Zechariah's practical teachings about faith and obedience, essentials for living in this world as we wait for those promises to be fulfilled. When it comes to fasting and faith, Zechariah's words take us to a deeper understanding of how our religious practices should align with God's heart. He tackled these topics with a clarity that cuts through time, challenging us to reflect on our intentions and motivations. Have you ever stopped to think about why you do what you do in your spiritual life? That's the core of Zechariah's message about fasting and faith. Outward actions only have value when they're backed by a genuine transformation of the heart. In chapter 7, the people of Bethel asked Zechariah whether they should keep fasting as they had during the exile. The prophet's response was both challenging and eye-opening. He asked, "When you fasted, was it really for me that you fasted?" Zechariah 7:5. That's a question that still hits home today. How often do we go through religious motions out of habit, tradition, or even to impress others, rather than doing them with hearts truly focused on God? Zechariah reminds us that God isn't interested in empty rituals. He's after authenticity. Zechariah went on to emphasize that true fasting wasn't just about abstaining from food, it was about justice, mercy, and compassion. He called the people to care for orphans, widows, foreigners, and the poor. In other words, true worship can't be separated from love for others. That's such a powerful practical lesson. Maybe you're wondering, what does that mean for me? It means our spiritual practices should transform us from the inside out, making us more aware of the needs around us. It could start with Small acts like helping someone in need or simply listening to a friend who's struggling. Zechariah also warned against hypocrisy. He reminded the people that their ancestors had ignored justice and hardened their hearts, which led to exile. That warning is just as relevant for us today. How often do we ignore the warning signs in our lives, stubbornly sticking to our own way, only to face the consequences later? Zechariah's message is clear. God wants our hearts to align with His will, not just our outward actions. What's fascinating is that Zechariah also looked ahead to a time when fasting would turn into celebration. He envisioned a day when God's presence would be so powerful among His people that fasting, once tied to mourning and repentance, would be replaced by joy and feasting. Zechariah 8:19. This points to Christ's kingdom, where peace and justice will reign, and it's a reminder for us that even in our darkest moments, God has the power to turn our sorrow into joy. Zechariah also stressed that faith must be the foundation of any spiritual practice. Fasting by itself isn't enough unless it's rooted in genuine trust in God. That's something we can apply directly to our lives. Think about the areas where your faith might feel shaky. Maybe it's in your career, a relationship, or even in your prayers. Zechariah challenges us to strengthen our faith, not through external actions, but by building a deeper connection with God. Another interesting point is how Zechariah's teachings on fasting and faith directly connect to Jesus' message. When Christ came, He echoed many of Zechariah's points, condemning hypocrisy and highlighting love for others as the greatest commandment. This shows the continuity of God's plan throughout history. His messages were never just for a specific time or place. They're timeless and meant for every generation. Speaking of application, Zechariah gives us an opportunity to rethink how we live out these teachings. Maybe it's time to take a closer look at our spiritual practices. Are we just going through the motions, or are we genuinely seeking God in everything we do? It could start with something as simple as setting aside intentional time for prayer, asking God to reveal areas in our lives that need transformation. Ultimately, Zechariah's message about fasting and faith reminds us that everything we do for God should be motivated by love. It's not about rules or traditions. It's about a living, vibrant relationship with the Creator. And as we reflect on that, we're drawn to consider the future Zechariah prophesied, where not just individuals, but entire nations will be united under God's just and perfect rule, something we'll dive into even deeper next. Zechariah wraps up his prophecies with breathtaking visions of the end times and the unification of all nations under God's rule. His final chapters are like a glimpse into the future, blending themes of judgment, victory, and redemption. These messages didn't just resonate with the people of his time, they carry a powerful relevance for us today, especially for those seeking to understand God's plans for humanity. One of the central themes is the final battle around Jerusalem. Zechariah describes a scene where nations will rise against the city, but at the darkest moment, God will step in with unmatched power. He speaks of a day when the Lord will fight like a warrior, defending His people and defeating their enemies. Zechariah 14:3. Imagine how this message would have impacted a people constantly facing external threats. It was a reminder that no matter the circumstances, God will always be the defender of those who trust in Him. And for us today, that promise still holds true. When we feel surrounded by battles in life, we can trust that God is our refuge. Fascinating detail is Zechariah's description of a radical change in Jerusalem's geography during these events. He mentions that the Mount of Olives will split in two, creating a massive valley, Zechariah 14:4. This imagery is both symbolic and literal, showcasing the sheer magnitude of God's power on the day of the Lord. It's a reminder that God isn't limited by anything, not nature, not human forces. When he acts, even mountains bow before him. Another intriguing point is the supernatural light Zechariah mentions on that day. He describes a time when there will be no distinction between day and night, because the Lord himself will be the light. Zechariah 14:6-7. This echoes Revelation, where John speaks of a new Jerusalem illuminated by God's glory. For us, this points to a future reality where God's presence will be so overwhelming that it will drive out all darkness, both physical and spiritual. It's a promise that, in the end, light always wins. But Zechariah doesn't stop there. He speaks of a time when all nations will come together to worship the King of Kings. This is significant because in Zechariah's day, the nations were often enemies of Israel. Yet the prophet envisions a future without division, where Jews and Gentiles are united under Christ's rule. It's a reminder that God's plan has always been global, embracing all peoples. For us, it's a call to pursue unity. How can we work to overcome divisions in our own communities and reflect the unity of God's kingdom? A practical example of this unity is the festival Zechariah mentions, the Feast of Tabernacles. He says all nations will go up to Jerusalem to celebrate this feast in honor of the Lord. Zechariah 14:16. This vision points to a time when worship will be central and universal, a moment when everyone will acknowledge God's sovereignty. And here's a lesson for us. True worship isn't limited by culture, language, or tradition. It's something that unites us as God's children. Zechariah also warns that those who refuse to honor the Lord will face consequences, like drought in their lands. This shows that the decision to worship God has eternal implications. It's not just a matter of ritual or obligation. It's a matter of spiritual life and death, and that's something worth reflecting on. Are we living in a way that reflects our submission to God's rule, or are we still clinging to our own personal kingdoms? Zechariah also shares a vision of holiness that permeates everything. He describes a time when even the bells on horses will be inscribed with "Holy to the Lord," Zechariah 14:20. This symbolizes that in God's kingdom, even the most ordinary things will be consecrated to Him. It's a powerful reminder of how we can live today. If everything in our lives, our actions, words, even our daily work, were dedicated to God, how would that change the way we live? Ultimately, Zechariah's message about the end times is one of hope. He reminds us that, despite battles, judgment, and hardships, God is preparing a glorious future where there will be no more tears, suffering, or division. It's an invitation to keep our eyes fixed on what's coming, even as we face the challenges of the present. And as we reflect on that future, we're challenged to think about how we can live in preparation for it. This ties back to the lessons of faith and daily practice that Zechariah shared throughout his book, creating a thread that helps us understand how to position ourselves as we wait for the fulfillment of all these promises. After diving into the story, visions, and lessons of Zechariah, one thing is crystal clear. He wasn't just a prophet from the past, his voice still echoes into the present. So here's the big question: what will you do with this knowledge? This isn't just about understanding historical facts or marveling at fulfilled prophecies. It's about reflecting. How can these messages transform your life today? Are you ready to rebuild what's been broken, like the people of Jerusalem? Or maybe it's time to align your faith with genuine action, just as Zechariah teaches us. Take a moment to think about it. What are the walls in your life that need rebuilding? Maybe it's your faith, your relationship with God, or even the way you view the future. Zechariah's message is an invitation to act. It's not about passively waiting for God to move, but actively participating in His plan. And the best part, He promises you don't have to do it alone, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, remember. That means you don't have to rely solely on your own strength. God is ready to work with you and through you. Now, Here's my challenge for you. If these words touched your heart, if you feel there's something in your life that needs to change, why not start today? It could be a heartfelt prayer, a step toward a new spiritual journey, or even sharing this message with someone you know needs to hear it. Sometimes the first step toward transformation is simply being willing to listen and obey. But before we wrap this up, I want to invite you to something even bigger. How about continuing this journey with us? Here on the channel, we're always sharing content like this, designed to help you grow spiritually and understand God's plans in a deeper, clearer way. So if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. And trust me, there's so much more good stuff on the way. And hey, right now, there are other videos popping up on your screen that can help you dive even deeper into the Bible and God's plan for your life. Click on one, keep learning, and let these messages transform not just what you know, but who you are. I'll see you in the next video. God bless you, and until next time.